I'd like to now turn our attention to the next theme, which is how to build capable institutions of self-governance. And here with us today is Jon Cooley, who's the Director of Wildlife and Outdoor Recreation for the White Mountain Apache Tribe, which won high honors in 2000, last year, for their Wildlife and Outdoor Recreation program. Had a chance to visit the reservation. It's simply fantastic. Whether you know it or not, I guess it was last year you got $38,000 for a single elk tag. It's a wonderful blend of conservation and profit-making activities. So, welcome, Jon.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks also for the invitation and the hospitality. It's been great. It is an honor for me as well to be here. As Andrew said, my talk is on building capable institutions of self-governance, and being the kind of analytical type person that I am, I'll break that into two big pieces. And keep in mind now that I'm here today in 2002, not because of what's really happened in the last few years or so. Our program today is a reflection of a lot of progress and a lot of hard work that has really gone on for decades at White Mountain. And basically, just to give you some really quick background on the program, our Wildlife and Outdoor Recreation Division is a blend of two different things happening at the same time. On the regulatory side, of course, we're responsible for the sustainable management of tribal resources, wildlife resources, and the conservation of those resources through our law enforcement branch. But on the other hand, we also serve as one of the most profitable, actually, of the tribal enterprises in terms of building a recreation and tourism economy for the tribe, which is really an important part of its entire business approach on the reservation there. So in terms of the building capable institutions part, as far as the White Mountain example is concerned, I think that really started with just building a tribal regulatory framework consisting of tribal codes, laws, and regulations that regulate not only tribal member activities as it relates to wildlife, but also non-tribal members coming onto the reservation, which clearly is an important first step. And then the other piece of that, of course, is building an organization. And through the years, we've gone through a lot of different changes. And today I'm happy to say that we have our professional branch of biologists consists all but I think 2 people, consists of tribal members, college-educated, degreed tribal members who act as our biologists both in terms of fisheries management and wildlife management. We started early on, though, of course, of bringing in skilled people from the outside, using 638 contracts and whatever was available to us, working with the BIA or the Fish and Wildlife Service to help build the capacity to manage our resources. But the vision all along was for us to do it, and to do it the way we felt was appropriate. Now, in terms of self-governance, to me implies empowerment and independence. And in the case of White Mountain, I think it also meant just the idea of controlling its own destiny as it related to, again, both running businesses and managing its resources. And when you control your own destiny, I think that goes further in implying that you're incorporating tribal values into the way that you do that. So we try to remain and always have remain cooperative, and we try to collaborate as much as possible with key players like the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Fish and Wildlife Service. But there's times when you run into a conflict between what may be national priorities or policies and what the tribe feels is important. So I think that's when you get into those situations where you have conflicting goals and ideas of what the future should be, is when you have to assert, and in our case we've asserted this notion of self-governance. And just again, in terms of background, two critical points I think in our development as an agency. The first was with the state of Arizona. This was back in the, I believe, the 70s, early 80s, when the state had jurisdiction over non-member hunting activities on the reservation, where they were required to purchase state permits in addition to our tribal permits. So there was a kind of a double permitting system going on there. Plus the tribe, because they were subject to these state regulations, wasn't able to develop its recreation and tourism businesses in the way it felt it should be able to. So we filed suit, and through a series of different cases ultimately prevailed. That in and of itself allowed the tribe then to develop its trophy elk hunting program that Andrew referred to earlier. I think the first hunt the tribe had, they probably, I think, brought in like 20 clients at $700 a piece, which at that time was, pretty outrageous. And, since have built it into $1 million operation. And in the process, we're employing tribal members and returning revenues back to the tribe. So again, it's a good thing for the tribe economically, and it's reflective of their desire to advance their business in the way they feel is appropriate, while also providing for the sustainable management of its resources. Another example is with Fish and Wildlife Service. Recently, the conflict was endangered species, and the way endangered species issues should be handled on tribal lands. And with the Endangered Species Act and the way it was being applied at the time, it was creating a lot of havoc on the reservations. I'm sure some of you are experienced as well. And again, it got to a point where we felt that, okay, we have this conflict in vision and goals here, and there's this approach sometimes from Washington that a one-size-fits-all, can work, and it just didn't in our case, and we challenged it. And the result of that was a cooperative agreement with Fish and Wildlife, where they basically recognized our institutional capacity to manage. Now, of course, we had to build upon that, because with that self-governance, of course, comes a lot of responsibility. And just recent examples of that collaboration with Fish and Wildlife is the Apache Trout Recovery Program. It's I think it's the only fish right now being considered for delisting. We played an active role in that. We've also just recently completed the development of a Mexican gray wolf plan. It's a tribal plan, though. It's not a Fish and Wildlife Service plan handed to the tribe. We developed it. So again, in this notion of self-governance, there's times when I think, in our case at least, we've just had to assert this idea of wanting to do it ourselves. And the reason is because we felt it was necessary to control our destiny and to make sure that the tribe's values were being reflected. I'd mentioned this idea of with self-governance comes a lot of responsibility. And I think in doing that, it's not this idea necessarily that you're out there on your own, because it is important to still network, and we do that as much as we can to utilize other agencies that are involved, whether it's Fish and Wildlife Service or the BIA or what have you. So the point is that we still try to foster those relationships as much as possible, because funding is usually a limiting factor, at least in our case, and it's important to maintain those ties. But in doing so, you have to be loyal to your community and to their interests and to those values that should be guiding our vision and our focus as an agency. So we try, when we work with these outside agencies, I think it's important to maintain that community connection and being loyal to your vision, basically, your mission. And throughout, whether it's on the business side for us or on the resource management side, sustainability of both is really critical. And I think it's important when talking about sustainable, how do you do that? What does that mean? Well, I think setting goals and setting benchmarks for yourself and your staff, and in our case as an agency, that's really important. And this gets back to the responsibility point as well. And accountability and having as much of a focus on results is, I think, important, because again, if we can't show a return, and I'm not just talking about a financial return, if we can't show a return in terms of sustainably managing the resources for the tribe, that's a return as well, then we're really not being effective, I feel. So stepping back, in closing, going outside of just our agency, and I guess what's made it grow and be successful, there's also the tribal, macro tribal organization that's involved as well, and I think it's always a struggle for us, as I'm sure it is for other tribes, but consistency, we were talking earlier, I think consistency is really important, and I'm talking about just having the support, the community support, and the political support to allow agencies to thrive and to innovate is really important. And in the case of White Mountain, I think that's been there to allow us to move forward, because obviously without some kind of degree of reliability, it's difficult for, I think, any program to really build a foundation, number one, and to move beyond that foundation. And in terms of sustaining self-governance through time, economic viability is important. And just in general, vision and leadership is critical, and a strong judicial system, I think, is really important. There needs to be that sense of fairness, and just in general, creating an environment as much as possible to allow organizations to be innovative and creative in how they do what they do, because ultimately that's what drives people to do good things at the end of the day. So with that, I'll close and take any questions you might have. Yes?
Jon, back to that two-part question. In order to match, it seems to me that your agency has many stakeholders.
Yeah.
You've got tribal leaders, you've got clients who are citizens of your nation, clients who are not citizens of the nation, you've got probably citizens of the nation who aren't your clients but have some viewpoints in what it is that you do. The first part of the question is, how do you, as an agent, take all of that information in, figure out what the harvest is going to be, or what the yield is going to be, or where the hunting is going to take place or not take place? The second part of the question just picks up on your closing remarks on what is it that the tribe or the council has done, or that you've done, that allows this innovation to take place?
Okay. As far as the first question is concerned, the process that we go through, we do have separate and distinct regulations. Well, I'll talk about hunting for non-tribal members and for tribal members. Deference is absolutely given to tribal members, because if they're not happy, we're not running a business. That's the bottom line. When we do the regulations for tribal members, we do public meetings. They're not necessarily always well attended, but the point is that we do make an effort to try to get public input. That's a fine line, though, because that public input is absolutely necessary, I think, to fine-tune regulations and to make it feel like we're being responsible and responsive. But at the same time, I'm always worried about management by public referendum, if you will. In other words, there's skilled technicians that need to have as much influence and input, I think, on those, especially the critical game management issues. So that is a fine line that we walk, but whenever we take those regulations to the council, who ultimately approves them before they're adopted, they'll always ask and want to know. that there's been some level of public input. So I think that's important. Now, as far as non-members are concerned, like I said, once we've done tribal, we have an idea of what our overall management objectives are, then we'll deal with the business side after we have a pretty good idea of how we're dealing with the tribal members. And we try to balance the two as much as possible because, again, we are running a business. That's how we fund our resource management, is by these permit revenues that are generated. Hope that answered your question. Okay, you're going to have to remind me of the second.
Oh, we're talking about allowing your institution to thrive and innovate.
Okay.
What is it that's at White Mountain Apache, whether it's on the council side or your side, that's allowed this to happen, to thrive and innovate as an institution? What is it that's thrived done well?
Well, I think first of all, there's a built-in incentive. The economic incentive is the better we can do managing the resource, the more funds we can generate to do our management and to hire good people and to hold them and hopefully motivate them in whatever fashion we can. Now, we don't pay big bonuses like Enron does, but we still, the point is that, you know, that I take the opportunity, at least I can't speak for my predecessors, but to show them that, hey, you guys can build your management programs if we can do well managing the resource and have the quality there that will attract this demand. But the bottom line is we have to, you know, our mission statement, the way it's written, it talks about the two major functions of our division. One is manage the resource in a sustainable fashion. Then, after we've done number one, but only after we've done number one, then we can talk about commercial success of the enterprise. And so I think that's one thing. But the other thing is just being bold and unbashful when, whether it's economic or political influences start to try to erode away at the morale or what have you, is just hold tight and beat the drum and you know, just remind people of what we're trying to do. And this gets back into goals and vision and what we're trying to do and how successful we've been up to now, and let's try to maintain the course as much as possible. Because, I mean, you know, I don't know about other places, but there is temptation sometimes for politics to kind of to get into the organization, and we try to fight that as much as possible. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Any other questions? Thank you.